In this audio, I will be reading a summary of Genesis that I made. There's a lot more that I want to say in this introduction that I'm not going to say. So this audio is only a sneak peek that I'm going to delete, and I'll probably make a better version later, but I'll at least say right now, read the real Bible if you want to know the Bible at all. Never rely on my summary that you're going to hear now for your knowledge of the Bible. This summary I made for myself to give me a fast reminder of the full text that I did read while making it. Anyhow, this is about 15 to 25% of the words. Some sections shortened kind of arbitrarily, maybe some would consider. Shortened like just arbitrarily more than others. But I hope you don't mind my preference of calling certain things fat that I decided to cut out and other things not. But once I begin, this summary should take about 45 or 50 minutes to read, whereas it would take me normally about 3 hours to read the full text of Genesis. So, let's begin. In Genesis, first God made physical and biological nature, as well as a ruling being in his image called humans. Adam, the male human, and Adam's best companion, Eve, the female human, all within 6 days. And God saw all of his creation as good. God rested on the seventh day and made it holy. From the center of the garden, God made for them. Eve ate the fruit that gives knowledge of good and evil, that God told them not to eat, warning they would die if they do. Eve ate it because a snake tempted her to, and she gave some to Adam. But the knowledge discomforted them both. God then punished Adam, Eve, and the snake for their lives, and restricted humans from another tree, that of eternal life. Adam and Eve had 2 sons, Cain and Abel. But after God paid heed to Abel's offering and not Cain's, Cain killed his brother Abel. God punished Cain. Cain left God's presence, yet God promised to avenge Cain if Cain was ever murdered. And Cain had a city and many descendants, one of whom threatened his wives with a similar God-promised vengeance because of his family relation to his ancestor Cain. Anyhow, Adam and Eve had a third son to replace Abel, named Seth. Seth had a son, and around then is when men began to invoke the Lord by name. Adam, Eve, Seth, and his sons all had other sons and daughters, many descendants, with unrelatably long lifespans. Then Noah was born, great grandson of Seth. When human population increased, divine beings reproduced with beautiful daughters of men, and heroic Nephilim appeared. All God's creatures became wicked except Noah, so God planned to drown all life in a flood, but instructed Noah to build an ark to save himself, his family, and a male and female of each creature to start new. After the flood, God promised to never doom earth again, even while men are evil, and promised humans shall rule over all life on earth. And Genesis says all present humans descended from Noah's 3 sons. One day, one of Noah's sons showed Noah's mess up, his drunken, naked sleep, to the other 2 sons, who then covered Noah. Noah cursed the son of the son who showed Noah's embarrassing imperfection of nakedness to the others. After considerable time, there were many descendants, and they all spoke the same language then. So they cooperated to build a city, which God regarded as evidence of their potential to advance too excessively. So then God made them speak different languages and scattered them. The city was called Babel because there God confounded their speech. One of the two sons who covered Noah's nakedness had a great grandson named Abram. God instructed Abram on a journey, promising Abram a nation of his own. Throughout Abram's journey, he came to Egypt, and in Egypt, the Pharaoh married Abram's beautiful wife after Abram cautiously lied that she is only his sister, only Abram's sister. Abraham was lying about this, that his wife is only his sister, because he knew she was so beautiful and someone might try to kill him, to take her from him if they knew that she was his wife. And the Pharaoh made them wealthy out of the, pretense of being in family. So then Abram became wealthy. The Pharaoh was punished by God for adultery, and realizing the truth, Pharaoh gave Abram his wife back and removed them from Egypt, but let Abram keep his wealth. This was, once the Pharaoh realized that this woman, who was supposedly only Abram's sister, was actually Abram's wife and should not be the Pharaoh's wife. But anyhow, Abram obeyed God, and God blessed Abram. Also, Abram rescued his travel partner, his nephew Lot, after they split during travels. They split to avoid quarrels. And the rescue involved defeating kings. Those kings, former victim kings, king of Sodom and king/priest Melchizedek of Salem, blessed Abram, for consequently partly restoring them too. Abram was selfless about the blessings and reciprocally generous. God promised Abram as many descendants as there are stars. Some of those descendants will suffer, then prevail. But his wife, Sarai, bore him none yet. So Sarai suggested that Abram should reproduce with her Egyptian slave. And he did, causing Sarai to then get jealous and mistreat her slave. But God talked tolerance into the slave, who bore Abram a son named Ishmael. God made a covenant with Abram to change his and Sarai's names to Abraham and Sarah, to follow God, to have nations of descendants of God's people, even through the formerly infertile Sarai, who will have a child next year, God said at this point in Genesis. And that was a surprising promise to Abram. And also in the covenant, God wanted for God's people to be circumcised. Abraham obeyed, circumcising himself and his family. Then in the story, Abraham met 3 men, and Abraham realized it was God who was coming to him in the experience of these 3 men. So Abraham treated them with hospitality. One of the men promised Sarah will have a child. She laughed skeptically, and God confirmed, asking why she laughed, which she denied doing, frightened. The 3 men then left towards Sodom, and God decided to converse with Abraham, since their relationship was so great, and converse about God's plan to punish the sinning city of Sodom and Gomorrah. Abraham asked God if God would spare the city, if the city had 50 innocent people, and God said yes, he would. Abraham then asked for the sake of 45 innocent people, etc., and etc., gradually down to 10, and God kept saying yes. Then at the end of that, lacking the innocent, God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah by sending 2 angels as men to rain fire. The nephew Abraham rescued earlier, whose name was Lot, lived there and was hospitable towards the angels before the attack, while the rest of the city was not. The angels made Lot and his family flee to spare them, and they escaped, but Lot's wife turned to salt, and Lot's daughters decided to reproduce with him when he became too senile to realize it, leading to many descendants. Abraham, during travels, almost deceived another ruler, King Abimelech. Again, that Sarah was his single sister, and God almost punished that king too, but God prevented the complete adultery and punishment, realizing the innocent intent of the deceived king, who really pleaded to God about this debacle that he was in. Also, Sarah is technically Abraham's half-sister, just not single. So the lie was excused as both partial and for caution. But anyhow, after the king learned the truth that Sarah is his wife, he returned her to Abraham and gave wealth to Abraham for generosity. And Sarah bore that child, Isaac, and Sarah thanked God and acknowledged the laughter God brought them by the joke of elderly reproduction. Sarah wanted Abraham to get rid of Ishmael and Sarah's slave who bore Ishmael to Abraham. Abraham, personally distressed, did so because God advised so too. God still promising descendants through both sons, Isaac and Ishmael. The slave mother left with Ishmael, and God protected them despite struggles. She found Ishmael an Egyptian wife eventually. Also, King Abimelech noticed and acknowledged the favor Abraham had with God. So on that basis, Abimelech respectfully asked Abraham to reciprocate loyalty, and Abraham did, even making a pact with Abimelech that a wholly new water well, Beersheba, was Abraham's, after Abimelech's servants seized Abraham's old one, unbeknownst to Abimelech. God tested Abraham, asking him to offer his favored son Isaac as a burnt offering to God. Abraham prepared to, then nearly did, but God stopped Abraham, approving and blessing Abraham for the unconditionally loyal fear of God which he exhibited in this, act of obedience. Also, Abraham's brother had several children. When Sarah died, Abraham bought a cave to bury her in from a Hittite who seemed to respectfully offer the cave for free in front of his people. But Abraham insisted to pay out of respect for the man and his people. Abraham sent his servant to find a willing wife for Isaac then, but only from the land of Abraham's father. The servant who went to go look for the wife also had God's will to make the search a success. And when he got to the land, he stopped at the water well when the daughters from that land came there to routinely gather their water. He prayed that whichever daughter help him drink and water his camels be the one for Isaac that he's looking for. And Rebekah helped him. And she was the virgin daughter of Abraham's nephew. Then Abraham's servant, who was on this journey to find the wife for Isaac, gave Rebekah gold, jewelry. Then she invited him to her home for further hospitality and told her family about him, who all agreed to let that servant in. Abraham's servant told his tale to Rebekah and her family about being sent to search for a wife for Isaac with God's will, and how Rebekah seems to be the one. The family seemed attached to Rebekah, but they and Rebekah consented, and Rebekah left with the servant to return to Isaac, who she did marry, comforting Isaac after his mother Sarah's death. Then Abraham took another wife and had more descendants, then died and was buried near Sarah in that cave. And Abraham gave his son Isaac the inheritance and the other sons gifts while alive, sending them eastward away from Isaac. Isaac had twins, difficult in Rebekah's womb, but God explained they'll lead to nations, and the older will serve the younger. After birth, the older, named Esau, became a hunter, favored by Isaac, and the younger, Jacob, became a cook, favored by Rebekah. The older, Esau, sold his birthright to the younger, Jacob, for a meal one day. During a famine, Isaac moved to Gerar, ruled by Abimelech. There, like his father, Isaac lied that Rebekah was only his sister, again out of caution. Abimelech found out that Rebekah's Isaac's wife, and to prevent guilt told everyone not to disrupt their marriage. Isaac became so wealthy there that they enviously kicked him out. So he moved to more rural Gerar. There were several disputes between Isaac and people of both urban and rural Gerar about water wells that were Isaac's. Isaac moved further, and God promised Isaac many offspring as fulfillment of the same promise to Abraham. Isaac built an altar, and Abimelech and men of Gerar sought a pact with Isaac after such hostility even, because they saw Isaac's favor with God. Esau took 2 Hittite wives who made Isaac and Rebekah bitter. One day Isaac was old and nearly blind, and then he asked his older son Esau to hunt an animal, cook it, and give the meal to him so he can give Esau his final life blessing. Rebekah overheard and plotted to trick Isaac into blessing her favored son, Jacob, by disguising Jacob as Esau and making Jacob offer his own cooked kid of the flock. Jacob was doubtful the trick would work, thinking Isaac would discern their identity. But Jacob obeyed his mother's plan. And before Esau returned from the hunt, Jacob deceived Isaac, who was skeptical and nearly discerned Jacob's true identity, yet ultimately was tricked, and gave Jacob Esau's blessing. Esau found out and became bitter, and told Isaac, who became surprised, and Esau asked for another blessing, this one for himself. The main blessing stayed Jacob's, but Isaac did bless Esau with a blessing that still said Esau shall serve Jacob, yet receive reprieve when tired. Esau was still bitter and planned to kill Jacob. So Rebekah made Jacob flee in hiding to her brother Laban until Esau might calm down. Also, Rebekah did not want Jacob to marry Hittite women like Esau had, and Isaac agreed, telling Jacob to go back to where Rebekah originally came from and find a cousin to marry, a daughter of Rebekah's brother Laban. He did, and Esau really noticed all of this advice that his parents were giving his younger brother Jacob about not marrying Hittite women, and Esau realized his Hittite wives made his parents bitter. So Esau got a third, more likable wife. On Jacob's journey to find a wife, he rested his head on a rock and dreamt God promised him countless descendants. After awakening, Jacob made that rock a holy pillar and told himself he'll be loyal to God if God aids him in this wife journey that he's making. Then, as Jacob got closer, he came to a well with a flock to be watered, and he asked the herdsmen if they knew Laban. They did, and showed Jacob that Rachel, Laban's daughter, was coming with the flock. Jacob helped Rachel, his cousin, water the flock, and eventually kiss her, explaining his family relationship. They both explained everything to Laban, and Laban accepted Jacob as family. Jacob served Laban 7 years in exchange for his daughter, expecting Rachel. But first he got the less beautiful daughter Leah, and had to serve another 7 years to get Rachel. So he married them both, but loved Rachel more. God had mercy on Leah's disfavor, making her have more children easier, while at first Rachel could not get pregnant. Rachel was jealous, and both Leah and Rachel tried to have more kids, even getting their maids to reproduce with Isaac on their behalf. Eventually Rachel did have a kid, after Leah and both their maids had several. When Jacob wanted to leave Laban finally, Laban agreed to pay him in certain flocks of animals for his years of service. But Laban deceived Jacob, restricting that certain flock from him, leaving Jacob with an unwanted flock. So Jacob tricked Laban back. Taking charge of the breeding of both their flocks, Jacob gradually made both flocks breed together, taking back the genetics he was promised, and further bred stronger ones in his own possession, and weaker in Laban's. Jacob grew wealthy doing this. Laban's sons and Laban's manor became more unfriendly towards Jacob. God told Jacob to leave Laban and return to his father Isaac's land. Jacob told his wives they will flee with him because Laban had cheated Jacob, changing the wages with the flock, for example, despite Jacob's loyal work. So Jacob fled secretly with his wealth, his wives, and his children. Rachel even stole her father Laban's idols when they fled. Laban realized they left and pursued them, but God warned Laban not to do anything to Jacob, good or bad. Laban caught up and couldn't find the idols Rachel stole. And then Laban and Jacob explained to each other their sides of the disagreements. Laban felt recently stolen from, and Jacob felt cheated over the years. Ultimately, they made a pact to peacefully separate, Jacob keeping his wives and kids, and Laban kissing them goodbye, after telling Jacob to treat them right, with God as their witness. As Jacob continued home, he sent a message ahead to his brother Esau, notifying him of their approach. The response Jacob got back was that Esau is coming to meet him with 400 men. Jacob was scared this meant Esau might attack, so Jacob strategized a safe approach to meet Esau, preparing gifts sent ahead for Esau in hopes of Esau choosing favor and friendship. Jacob sent much of his crowd ahead of himself, and while alone, Jacob wrestled with a mysterious man who realized he lost against Jacob, then injured Jacob's hip and told Jacob to change his name to Israel because the wrestle symbolized Jacob's victorious strife with divine and human beings. To this day, Jews/Israelites don't eat hip muscle of animal to commemorate Jacob's transcendentally wounded hip. Esau reached Jacob, and both brothers were respectful and friendly. Esau humbly rejecting gifts, but then accepting after Jacob's insistence. Esau started back home, and Jacob followed slower for his weak flock's pace, and eventually arrived. Then someone raped one of Jacob's daughters, and the rapist and his family wanted to unite with Jacob's to share each other's possessions and daughters. Jacob's sons, furious their sister was raped, deceptively agreed upon uniting under the condition that the rapist and his men become circumcised. And they accepted, circumcising themselves. And while in pain still, Jacob's sons killed them. Jacob disapproved, fearing now that they might be attacked due to a bad reputation, and be attacked by stronger people in the land of the rapist. But the brothers expressed to Jacob that it's right to avenge their sister. God told Jacob to go back to that same rock he rested his head on, where God appeared to him in a dream back during that flee from Esau, and to build an altar there. So Jacob did, bringing his whole household, stripping themselves of much sin, while God caused their neighbors to fear pursuing Jacob's sons. When they arrived, Jacob built that altar. Also, Rebekah's nurse died and was buried, and finally Jacob changed his name to Israel. Then they kept traveling, and Rachel died in labor of her second child, as God promised a boy. One of Israel's sons from Leah committed adultery with Israel's concubine, and Israel found out. After Rachel's second son, Israel's sons totaled 12. Israel returned to his father Isaac. Then Isaac died of old age, and Esau and Israel buried him. Esau moved away from Jacob to separate their possessions, both too great to dwell together. Esau had several descendants, and other family of his had several descendants. In that land of people descended from Esau, there became several generations of kings, even before the days of Israelite kings. Israel stayed in the land where his father Isaac was while alive, and Israel favored his son Joseph, Rachel's firstborn. Jacob's other sons were jealous of their brother Joseph. Joseph had dreams which his brothers and one which his father interpreted as conceited. Dreams where existence bowed to Joseph and what was Joseph's. One day, Joseph's brothers were away pasturing their father's flock, and Israel told Joseph to go check on them. When Joseph did, his brothers almost decided to kill him, but threw him into a pit instead, then sold him to traders, deceiving their father that he died from a wild animal. Israel mourned. The traders sold Joseph to the Pharaoh's courtier. Then Joseph's brother, Judah, a son of Leah, moved and had 3 kids, the 2 oldest of whom displeased God, so God took their lives before they reproduced. And a wife, who Judah found for them, was wedded to the oldest first, then to the next oldest, who refused to reproduce with her, knowing the baby would be counted as his dead brothers. But when he died too, the woman was promised to the third, the youngest son of Judah. So she moved away and waited while he grew up. One day, disguised as a prostitute, she got pregnant from Judah while he was traveling. And for sex, he pledged some of his immediate belongings as a promise to pay in a young animal later. Then he could not find her nor get his pledge back. He heard that she was his son's widow, pregnant from him, and he was furious when he found out about this. But she then returned his pledge, and he did not kill her, as he thought she's more in the right than he is, since he had not yet given her his promised youngest son as a husband. And she had twins from Judah, and one almost came out first, but then the other did. Joseph was favored so much by God that even in Egypt, his master, Potiphar, the Pharaoh's courtier, noticed. So put Joseph in charge of his house, which God then also blessed for Joseph's sake. Joseph was attractive, and Potiphar's wife tried to sleep with Joseph, but Joseph refused, and she lied, saying he raped her. Potiphar then had Joseph thrown in jail, yet God was with Joseph there too, causing the chief jailer to favor Joseph, putting Joseph in charge of the other prisoners. One day, the Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker offended the Pharaoh, so were thrown in jail with Joseph. Joseph interpreted both of their dreams correctly for them. First, the cupbearer will be released, who Joseph asked that when this prediction comes true, to tell the Pharaoh Joseph is innocent. The baker requested Joseph's interpretation of a dream, hoping for a similarly favorable future, but Joseph said the baker will be impaled. It all came true, both of their dreams, but for some time the cupbearer forgot to mention Joseph to the Pharaoh. Then the Pharaoh had two dreams. One where 7 strong cows were eaten by 7 weak ones, and another where 7 strong grains were overtaken by 7 weak ones. No one could interpret the Pharaoh's dream until the cupbearer finally remembered to mention Joseph, now recommending him. Pharaoh asked Joseph, and Joseph gave credit to God for what he will interpret. Joseph said the dreams meant 7 years of abundance will come, then 7 years of famine will follow. And dreaming it twice meant God has certainly decided on this destiny, because both dreams are in essence the same. And Joseph recommended preparing for famine during the abundance. The Pharaoh was so impressed with Joseph's interpretation and plan that the Pharaoh gave great authority to Joseph and called him a name that gives credit to God, and gave Joseph a wife, the priest's daughter. The 7 years of abundance came, and Joseph was in charge of storing grain. Also, with his wife he had 2 kids, with names that symbolized Joseph forgetting his affliction and flourishing through it. Then the 7 years of famine came, and everyone relied on Joseph's rations to survive. Joseph's brothers, who formerly mistreated him, even came for food, but their father Israel did not send the youngest, Benjamin, Joseph's only full brother from mother Rachel, because Israel feared disaster for Benjamin. The brothers who did go to Egypt to ask Joseph for food did not recognize Joseph as their brother, and they bowed to him. Joseph secretly recognized them, and remembered the dreams of them bowing to him that he had a while ago, that they interpreted as conceited. Joseph treated them harshly, pretending to think they were hostile, even spies, and withheld their money from them. They denied the accusations, explaining who they are and who their family is. Joseph then planned to give them food to take home, but demanded they bring back their youngest brother Benjamin as proof of their honesty. And Joseph held one other brother ransom to be released when they bring Benjamin. During all this, they said God was punishing them for mistreating Joseph, which Joseph overheard and secretly wept. Joseph sent them home with food and the agreement to bring Benjamin back in exchange for the ransom brother. And Joseph secretly slipped their money back into the food bags, which they found, mystified. When they got home, they explained everything to Israel, including why a brother is being held ransom by the Lord of Rations. They still hadn't realized it was Joseph, and they requested Benjamin, but Israel was indignant and reluctant to send Benjamin. The famine was so severe that the brothers did persuade their father Israel to let them take Benjamin to Egypt to exchange for their ransomed brother and for more food, promising to return with Benjamin. Israel advised them to bring gifts for the Lord of Rations, who they did not know was Joseph, and to bring double that money that was replaced in their bags, in case it was mistakenly replaced. All the brothers did so, and after arriving in Egypt, Joseph saw Benjamin, and Joseph became so hospitable towards them that they were skeptical, thinking the hospitality was a trap to enslave them for keeping the money that they now worried was mistakenly replaced. They presented the gifts. Joseph was kind and released the ransomed brother, and Joseph had a meal prepared for them, which astonished them. Joseph sat them oldest to youngest, giving the biggest meal to Benjamin, his mother's son. Joseph secretly wept after seeing Benjamin. Joseph dined separately with the Egyptians, who consider it wrong to eat with Hebrews. When Joseph sent his brothers back towards home with food, he secretly slipped a silver goblet into Benjamin's bag and pretended they stole it. The brothers pleaded their innocence, and Joseph said, "Whoever's bag he finds it in shall be his slave." And, of course, he found it in Benjamin's bag. And they explained to Joseph how they promised their father Benjamin would return safely, and their father's reluctance to send Benjamin along to Egypt, even the second time, after Joseph insisted on seeing Benjamin, and their father Israel's attachment to Benjamin, since Israel thought his other favored son Joseph was dead. And they also explained how upset their father would be if they did not return with Benjamin. So finally, Joseph had everyone else withdrawn so that he was alone with his brothers, and wept, telling his brothers he is their brother Joseph, asking how his father is. The Egyptians overheard and told the Pharaoh. The brothers were dumbfounded and could not speak until Joseph wept on them. Joseph told his brothers to go back home and tell his father, their father, Israel, that Joseph invites him to live in Egypt in his new high rank. The Pharaoh agreed, magnifying the invitation, saying also the brothers and their father may live off the fat of Egypt, and provided them wagons and supplies for the journey back and forth. Joseph gave Benjamin the most supplies. When the brothers got home and told Israel the reality about Joseph, Israel didn't believe it at first, but when he finally did, his spirit revived, and he wanted to see Joseph alive. So Israel set out for Egypt with his possessions, sacrificing to God on the way, who promised Israel blessings in Egypt. Israel brought all his sons, their wives, and children, totaling 70 people. Israel came to Goshen, a place in Egypt, and Joseph met with him there and wept on him. Joseph said the Pharaoh will let Israel and his family stay with their flocks of animals only in Goshen, as long as they tell the Pharaoh they're shepherds when he asks, but Goshen only, since shepherds are abhorrent to Egyptians. So Joseph's father and brothers did respectfully say they were shepherds when presented to the Pharaoh, and the Pharaoh welcomed and respected them. As the famine continued, all the people around gave all their money to Joseph for bread, then gave him their livestock when they needed more bread, then their land, then sold themselves as serfs to survive. All this wealth Joseph gained for the Pharaoh, except priests kept their land because they already had an allotment of food promised by the Pharaoh. Joseph made it a rule that 1/5 shall be the Pharaoh's, priests exempt, Joseph's father Israel asked Joseph to bury him in his father's land when he dies, not in Egypt, and Joseph promised him he will. When Israel became ill, Joseph visited him, and Israel reminded Joseph of God's promises of countless descendants. Then said Joseph's 2 sons shall be Israel's sons, and only Joseph's next sons shall be Joseph's, since Rachel, Israel's wife, died during that former journey together. Then, while blind, Israel blessed Joseph's 2 sons, but Israel blessed the younger son greater, and Joseph tried to correct Israel. But Israel confirmed/insisted the younger son shall be greater. Then Israel gave Joseph a larger inheritance than to Joseph's brothers. Israel then called his sons together and poetically described some of their futures, commenting on all of them, like their lives and characters. Some got favorable words from Israel, like praise in the future to come, and some to prevail over enemies, or favorable words like how God has blessed Joseph. And some got disfavorable words from Israel for their sins, like fury and adultery. Israel said bye to them, and again asked to be buried where his fathers Abraham and Isaac were buried with their wives, where Israel buried his wife Leah in that cave that Abraham bought from the Hittites. When Israel died, Joseph cried and kissed him and made the physicians embalm Israel, a 40-day procedure. There was a lengthy crying for Israel's death, even by the Egyptians, who then accompanied Joseph and Israel's family to the cave burial site, where they mourned for 7 days as a large group. Joseph's brothers feared Joseph would get revenge on them for back when they mistreated Joseph. So they told Joseph that back when alive, Father Israel wanted to give instructions to Joseph to forgive his brothers. His brothers exhibited their fear and subservience to Joseph, but Joseph forgave them, saying their harmful intentions were God's good plan, since it did lead to Joseph helping people survive from Egypt. Joseph lived for a while longer and lengthily reminded his brothers of God's promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Israel of giving their descendants land, saying that when God does notice them, to take Joseph's bones up there from Egypt. Joseph died, and in the meantime was embalmed and placed in a coffin. And that's Genesis.